All right, we're going to round out our introduction to modernism by talking about one of the other great prominent modernist writers, Virginia Woolf. I'd argue that Joyce and Woolf are the two best writers of the early 20th century, and Yeats would be right there with them in poetry. What they achieved in fiction is really unparalleled. And they both pioneered the stream of consciousness technique. We didn't really get to see an example of that from in Joyce, but we're blessed with the short story we have from Woolf here in our anthology, The Mark on the Wall. We're really able to see um, that technique there. So we'll discuss stream of consciousness in terms of what Woolf achieved, and also talk a little bit about feminism and how she was a landmark figure in that regard. Woolf was born into a publishing family as the daughter of Julia Jackson Duckworth. And I mentioned that because probably at some point when you're reading a book, especially from England, you look down and see the publishing company as Duckworth. So publishing was just part of her life. She was born into a family business of publishing, and her husband Leonard later established their own publishing company. Her father was a prominent intellectual, and so writing in the intellectual life came naturally to her in the house where she grew up. So she was another one of those writers, like we've talked about, who grew up in this house with lots of reading, where her parents really encouraged her to read and to write. Um, However, her youth was really unfortunately shadowed by suffering. One of her half brothers sexually abused her, and numerous people died early on. Her mother died when she was, I think, only 13. She was still relatively young when her father died, late teens, early 20s, I think. And then several of her brothers or half brothers, other ones died. And so, really, really tragic. And there's been a lot of speculation by critics to what degree the sexual abuse she experienced at the hands of her half brother affected her life and her writing. Um, we do know that she suffered with very severe depression, and that she eventually um, killed herself. To what extent that was impacted by the wounds of her childhood, we can only speculate. But suffice to say, she had a very, tragic upbringing, and so that should not be overlooked when we consider her life in works. Her father died in 1904, so she was actually uh, in early 20s when he died. And at that point, her and several of her brothers and sisters, she had a pretty big family of siblings and half siblings. Some of them settled in the Bloomsbury district of London, and this ended up being very important to her because there was this group of intellectuals from the middle and upper middle class called the Bloomsbury Group. And so she really thrived circulating among that group. You could argue that the Bloomsbury Group provided something similar to her that the expatriates provided for Joyce in France. One aspect of this group was their very free thinking, I guess would be the word, attitudes toward gender relations and sexuality. Um, Many of them were homosexual, and Woolf herself had a long affair with a woman 13 years into her marriage. So, um, that's important context for understanding her literary career, because I said she has some kind of, you could say, landmark statements in terms of the development of feminism. In one of her novels, Orlando actually depicts a character who lives for several centuries and switches genders multiple times throughout um, his/her lifespan. A little more about Woolf. In 1917, her and her husband founded Hogarth Press, which was an important press at that time. It published Woolf herself and T.S. Eliot and a number of other prominent writers at that time. As I mentioned earlier, she suffered from periods of severe depression and eventually took her own life in 1941. So she had a fairly long life where she had really significant literary contributions, but she was never able to escape um, this depression, and she eventually drowned herself in the Lake District in England in 1941. Um, in addition to her literary contributions, she made significant contributions to critical theory, and as a feminist critical theory for analyzing literature has been developed in the later 20th century, I would argue that Woolf's text, A Room of One's Own, is actually foundational to feminist critical theory. One of the chapters from it, Shakespeare's Sister, is included in our textbook. And what she does there, the title itself, A Room of One's Own, really explains what the book is about. Um, it's about what women could achieve if given the opportunity to write and publish, which Woolf did during her life, and she had these major achievements, these novels that have been incredibly influential. Um, but I think she's looking back here to women like Jane Austen and the Brontes and George Eliot, who felt for whatever reasons, and we know what they are, but I meant they varied amongst them, is why I said whatever. So for a variety of reasons, they didn't publish under their own names and used male names instead, um, or published like anonymously in Austen's case. So if women are really free to just write and publish without the constrictions of a patriarchal society, what could they achieve? They could achieve a great deal. And Woolf shows that in her literary career and makes an argument for it in A Room of One's Own. This is another reason why having her own publishing company was so important. It illustrates what she could achieve. But in the chapter, Shakespeare's Sister, she imagines um, what Shakespeare's sister would have been like, and argues that essentially the argument in depicting this fictional sister of Shakespeare is that a female could have achieved just what Shakespeare did had the gender conventions been different at that time. So she argues that Shakespeare's genius and intellect is not unique to him, um, and makes the argument that others would be capable of that, specifically women, if given the opportunity. So foundational in terms of critical theory, much like other writers we've studied, like Arnold and Keats and Wordsworth and Coleridge, but in this case, a female writer, Woolf, making one of the most significant statements in feminist critical theory. So let's take a look at the story, A Mark on the Wall, and what it achieves. Two important things to note first about Woolf's writing style. She sought to render very intricately those aspects of consciousness in which she felt the truth of human experience lay. So I talked a little bit about the stream of consciousness technique, how it takes the reader inside the character's mind. Joyce and Woolf really did this. They're really the high modernists in terms of the interiority, the psychology, going inside a character's mind to show the modernist condition. And so human consciousness, it was really the key for her, for unlocking what art could do in response to modernity. It was using work to penetrate the depths of the character's mind. In her novels, she abandoned linear narratives in favor of interior monologues and stream of consciousness narration, exploring with great subtlety problems of personal identity and personal relationships, as well as the significance of time, change, loss, and memory for human personality. So if you look at Joyce or Woolf's novels, such as Mrs. Dalloway, which, as I mentioned, is unfortunately too long to read in a class like this, but an amazing novel, you have stream of consciousness almost the whole way through, where instead of traditional narration, you have characters' thoughts. And you might make a jump from one character to another, or from one thought to another, without any kind of formal identification of that transition or shift. And so modernist novels are short, which is helpful because you have to read them and reread them and take copious notes to really understand what's happening. Whereas Victorian novels are these big baggy monsters that are like 900 pages, but you can read in one go and get a lot out of. So that's an important transition. The Victorians focused on plot. They had lengthy works. Then the modernists focused on character and technique and had short works and worked on penetrating the character's mind as a means of grappling with modernity rather than using a very realist mode to tell you what's happening and cast a social critique. Those are the key differences between the Victorian and the modern periods. And Woolf, I think, more than anyone else, really illustrates them in her fiction. And you have, as I mentioned, these time shifts or these consciousness shifts, where you're inside one character's mind, you might all of a sudden be inside another. I think we get a good kind of sampling of that here in The Mark on the Wall, where it's the rambling thoughts of it's a person looking at the wall, which you or I might be doing on a Friday night. Hopefully, you have more exciting plans than I do, but we might be looking at a mark on the wall, and a dozen different thoughts might run through our head. And that's literally what happens in this story, which is very emblematic of modernism. Modernists take very mundane things. For instance, Joyce in Ulysses takes a day in the life of an insurance salesman and elevates it to the point of using Greek mythology to tell that story of a day in the life of an insurance salesman. Here with Wolfe, you have, you know, someone looking at a mark on the wall and a dozen or more different thoughts running through her head. But what happens is in these thoughts, she makes connections to larger, more universal suffering that is part of modernity. And so, as you follow the mental shifts of the character, the changes in the pattern of thought, you eventually see how they connect to these larger issues, how they connect to the modern condition. And that's the beauty, that's the achievement of Wolfe's writing. So let's look and see how that. At the end of the first paragraph, we have the first truly stream of consciousness moment. So we're going to look at that just to illustrate what stream of consciousness is. I looked up through the smoke of my cigarette, and my eye lodged for a moment upon the burning coals. And that old fancy of the crimson flag flapping from the castle tower came into my mind, and I thought of the cavalcade of red knights riding up the side of the black rock. Rather to my relief, the sight of the mark interrupted the fancy, for it is an old fancy, an automatic fancy, made as a child perhaps. The mark was a small round mark, black upon the white wall, about 6 or 7 inches above the mantelpiece. And actually, um, okay, never mind. I thought I left part off. That's the full quote. So, as I said, this passage provides an excellent example of stream of consciousness, um, because we're getting the narrator's direct thoughts. For we see that there's this kind of reverie, a memory from childhood, and then that's interrupts. So the narrator here in the opening paragraph is looking around the room and seeing different objects, seeing coals in the fire, and that brings back this one memory, but then she sees the mark on the wall that interrupts it. And the narrator didn't really like that memory. And so she expresses that that's a good thing. So we are privy to her thoughts here, and we see a shift from one focus to another in her train of thought as she looks about the room. That stream of consciousness. So what happens as this continues to progress? And this next quote is very long. It's the entire third paragraph that ends at the bottom of the first page, 272. I can only fit so much on the slide, so I'm going to keep reading after what I have here on the slide. But for that mark, I'm not sure about it. I don't believe it was made by a male after all. It's too big, too round for that. I might get up, but if I got up and looked at it, 10 to 1, I shouldn't be able to say for certain, because once a thing's done, no one ever knows how it happened. Oh, dear me, the mystery of life, the inaccuracy of thought, the ignorance of humanity, to show how very little control of our possessions we have, what an accidental affair this living is after all our civilization. Let me just count over a few of the things lost in one lifetime, beginning, for that seems always the most mysterious of losses, what cat would gnaw, what rat would nibble, 3 pale canisters of bookbinding tools. Then there were the bird cages, the iron hoops, the steel skates, the Queen Anne coal scuttle, the bagatelle board, the hand organ, all gone, and jewels too. Opals and emeralds, they lie about the roots of turnips. What a scraping, paring affair it is, to be sure. The wonder is that I've any clothes on my back, that I sit surrounded by solid furniture at this moment. Why, if one wants to compare life to anything, one must liken it to being blown through the tube at 50 miles an hour, landing at the other end without a single hairpin in one's hair, shot out at the feet of God entirely naked, tumbling head over heels in the asphodel metals like brown paper parcels pitched down a chute in the post office with one's hair flying back like the tail of a racehorse, as that seems to express the rapidity of life, the perpetual waste and repair, all so casual, all so haphazard. So what you have here is the narrator speculating on what the mark on the wall means. And so as she does that, we move through her thought process. She jumps around to all different thoughts, and we, the readers, move with her if we can keep up. But her inability to identify the mark on the wall leads to deeper thoughts about loss and the fluidity of life, aspects of the modern condition. She goes through a list of everything that's lost. She says the beginning, that always seems the most mysterious of losses, so we don't know our origin. All these things lost are objects, but they represent or they signify greater losses. In the part that I couldn't fit on the slide, she eventually talks about being blown through the tube, which is the underground railway, the subway essentially in London, so a modernist invention, and shot out the other end naked at the feet of God. And what this represents, she says, is the rapidity of life, the perpetual waste and repair, also casual, also haphazard. To me, that really describes modernity. The rapidity of life. These changes are coming at an unprecedented rate. The perpetual waste and repair. The sheer loss of life in World War I, such a waste. Also casual, also haphazard. Like like Joyce, the paralysis, we're not feeling, we're casual, we're haphazard, we're not feeling at the shearing loss, the waste we see in World War One. And so by just not being able to identify the mark on the wall, her mind is then able to segue to all these big claims that show us all these important things about modernity. That's the power of stream of consciousness, and that's what Woolf's fiction really contributes to literary history. Let's look at more about how that develops, why that's so important as we continue to work our way through the story. Um, Further along, she says, as we face each other in omnibuses and underground railways, we are looking into the mirror that accounts for the vagueness, the gleam of glassiness in our eyes. And the novelist and future will realize more and more the importance of these reflections. For, of course, there is not one reflection, but an almost infinite number. Those are the depths they will explore, those the phantoms they will pursue, leaving the description of reality more and more out of their stories, taking a knowledge of it for granted, as the Greeks did in Shakespeare perhaps, but these generalizations are very worthless. So what you really have here is the modernist reaction against realism. Remember, realism is kind of synonymous with Victorianism. And so kind of connecting this passage to the last passage, um, when she talks about lost and not understanding origins, reality was a slippery, fluid thing. The Victorians tried to stabilize everything, and in writing realist fiction, they tried to pin down a clear, finite definition of reality. The modernists realized that that is impossible. Um, you can't easily pin down and define things, which is really what this story is about defining things. She can't identify what the mark on the wall is. The modernists think of the ground being pulled out from under you, like in the Yeats poem. They couldn't identify things, they had no foundation. That's the modern condition. And so she's saying realism is outdated. Realism doesn't make sense. And she alludes to the idea that some of the great writers, the Greeks and Shakespeare, were perhaps not realists. So, moving on, I want to look at another passage because I talked about how Woolf's work as a critic is a landmark in terms of the development of feminism as a critical theory for examining literature. And we've mainly talked about the negatives of modernity. But change is inevitable, and there are positives with change. So let's take a look at this passage here. What now takes the place of those things, I wonder, those real standard things? Men, perhaps. Should you be a woman, the masculine point of view which governs our lives, which sets the standard, which establishes Whitaker's table of precedency, which has become, I suppose, since the war, half a phantom to many men and women, which soon, one may hope, will be laughed into the dustbin where the phantoms go. The mahogany sideboards and the Landseer prints, gods and devils, hell and so forth, leaving us all with an intoxicating scent of illegitimate freedom, if freedom exists. So, if we have a more tenuous grip on reality, if the ground has been pulled out from under us, if the more foundational things are disappearing, if we can no longer provide concrete definitions for things because reality itself has become tenuous, maybe some of the bad things, for instance, such as patriarchy, are disappearing as well. A patriarchy like the one that existed in Victorian England depends on absolute, finite, concrete, exact definitions and delineations of gender roles. If those things can no longer be defined so clearly, perhaps some freedom for women might come along with it. And as hard as these changes are to deal with, that's some of the good that might come out of the inevitable but tragic changes. And so Wolf's making a very important point here that I think is an important one because we've only mainly looked at kind of the negative effects of modernity. But modernity is inevitable. And that's what I think that's the key difference between Victorians and moderns is Victorians didn't acknowledge that modernity was inevitable. They fought against it. The moderns here, they're not ready to embrace it to the degree that the postmoderns are. But with Wolf here, we have a glimpse of what it can create. So obviously, more freedom for women is a good thing. But that does not mean that modernity itself in general is a good thing. And so that's the complex, ambivalent relationship to change that every writer, that every human being has to change. And so Wolf is not just making an argument for feminism here, but hitting at the human condition. Just a couple more passages and we'll wrap up. So she talked about getting up out of her chair to look more closely at the mark on the wall and try to identify what it is. She actually does that later in the story. I must jump up and see for myself what that mark on the wall really is. A nail, a rose leaf, a crack in the wood. Here is nature once more, her old game of self-preservation. This train of thought, she perceives, is threatening mere waste of energy, even some collision with reality. For who will ever be able to lift a finger against Whitaker's table of precedency? So the narrator all of a sudden has this compulsive desire to get up and figure out what the mark is. Her thoughts have been wandering, and she knows if she figures out what the mark is, that will stop the wandering. And she can't really resist the desire to do that. So, in other words, there's a positive aspect to the fluidity of modernity. It could create a path for something like feminism, but at the same time, modernity means embracing the unknown, and people aren't ready to do that. It's dangerous, and so you see that tension depicted quite well here. Whitaker's table of precedency is this kind of booklet that outlines who is at the top of society. The Norton Anthology explains it better than me, but that has come in the story to represent the kind of the old standards and old traditions. And so she's saying we can't truly overcome the old standards and traditions because fundamentally in our human nature we desire a firm foundation. Pulling out the ground from under us might be necessary to do away with the patriarchy and blaze a path for feminism, but pulling the ground out from under us is an unsettling feeling. Can we ever really embrace that? That's the conflict, the tension here. That's the conflict, the tension of modernism. And the Victorians talked a great deal about energy. And so the kind of random train of thought here would be a waste of energy in the Victorians, period. They would say, get to the point, tell us a narrative. But she's not telling us a narrative. She's telling us her thoughts. And I think she sees something productive in that actually is a good use of energy, even though the Victorians would disagree. It can certainly blaze a path for feminism, even if it means embracing the unknown and the dangers. Finally, we're going to wrap up by looking at the very last lines of the story where the train of thought is interrupted by the first instance of dialogue. I don't want to make any missteps here with gender pronouns, but whenever I read this story, I just picture it as Virginia Woolf, the narrator, and Leonard Woolf, her husband. So that's just how I'm going to roll with it for the sake of the ease of describing this scene. I'm going to buy a newspaper. Yes? Though it's no good buying newspapers, nothing ever happens. Curse this war. God damn this war. All the same, I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. Ah, the mark on the wall, it was a snail. So the stream of consciousness is interrupted by the first passage of dialogue in the story. That's a typo. While the speaker contemplates issues similar to ones that just ran through the narrator's mind, he's also cursing World War One, struggling with the human condition. He precisely and concretely identifies the mark on the wall. So the mark on the wall, each interaction with it spurs a different thought in the narrator's stream of consciousness or train of thought. But the ability to identify, to clearly, sharply define the mark on the wall ultimately ends the story and ends that train of thought. And it's something, as we saw in the last slide, she's wrestled with all throughout. So what does this finite ending to a story mean in a story where we've been reading all these more fluid, less than finite things? Woolf provides an idea that has been around since at least we studied Sir Walter Scott, that change is difficult but inevitable. So she uses modernist techniques to convey that idea, and outlines both the positive and negative changes that are part of modernity. So like for Scott, change is inevitable and it's hard. It's going to cause suffering and tragedy, but it's inevitable. So at some point we have to accept it. For Woolf, that means accepting that the ground is being pulled out from under us. But the ground being pulled out from under us means there might be some kind of radical, positive, good change coming. Because certainly not everything that came before was good. Even if some of it was good, and even if losing it causes suffering, some of it was bad. A lot of it was bad. So having the ground pulled out from under us is not necessarily a bad thing. That's a radical idea. It's a modernist idea, but it's a modernist idea that gestures toward postmodernism, which is what we'll talk about in the next lecture.